And we're with Peter Russell. I'm Steve Fryer, and my co-host Kathleen Jacoby is with me in the studio. And we're going to be talking about consciousness. Peter, you are the author of a book, Waking Up in Time, and it's basically about finding inner peace, about consciousness. But you are a theoretical physicist with a degree from the University of Cambridge in England. And, you know, it's interesting. I'd like to know how you got into this whole idea of consciousness when you were a physicist to start off with.
Yes, it actually, in a way, it came out of the physics I was doing. I was doing physics because I was good at it. I'd been good at it at school, so it was my natural choice at university. I was fascinated by it. And at the time, I was actually studying with Stephen Hawking for a while when he could still walk and talk. And in fact, it was while I was working with him that I came upon, I suppose, say it was an existential crisis, really. It was like, I realized that no end of physics, however much physics I did, it was never going to tell me anything about the human mind. And the really fascinating question for me was, how did this universe, and I was studying, the quantum equation of hydrogen atoms, how did hydrogen ever evolve into beings such as ourselves, capable of going back and understanding hydrogen? And that was the fascinating thing, was human consciousness. And here was I, a conscious being, fascinated by what my consciousness could understand about the physical world, and yet there was absolutely nothing anywhere in any of the sciences that predicted human beings should be conscious. And so I got fascinated by the whole subject of consciousness. What is consciousness? And that's really what started me off.
Don't they have a pretty good philosophy department there at Cambridge?
They do, and I looked at it and I decided it was pretty good, but not at all for the areas I wanted. They weren't interested in consciousness there. They were interested in studying modern philosophers and logical positivism and that sort of stuff, which I'd done enough logic and things in my mathematics and physics. And I decided the closest I could get to doing what I wanted to do was actually psychology. And so I stopped doing physics and did a degree in experimental psychology, which is really the study of the normal, healthy brain, how perception works, how memory works. And then I went out east after that, because I realized that there was a certain amount that the Western psychology knew about the brain, but there's a lot more that the East knew about consciousness. And so went out and...
You mean the East?
But I went to India.
India.
I went to India to study meditation and study Eastern philosophy.
And what good did that do you? What good did that do you?
What good did that do me? I think it did me a lot of good, several ways. I think, first of all, just really getting an in-depth training in meditation, I think, has been really useful as a means of just, first of all, just quietening my own mind, I think has been absolutely valuable. But secondly, I think the major shift that happened when I was in India was realizing there was something to spirituality after all. I'd rejected religion when I was about 13, I suppose, being
many of us.
Yes, being a young budding scientist growing up in Western culture. It was a choice between what science was saying about the creation and life and what I was being told in church, and it seemed to me obvious which one made the most sense. And I think when I was in India, I realized that maybe there was something to religion after all, that there was a common underlying theme there.
Did you start then to apply, to use your Western trained, logical, scientific mind to the study of spirituality and meditation?
Yes, I did. In fact, what happened was when I came back from India, I ran a meditation center for a while, and then I did a PhD on meditation, the first one in England, on the physiology of meditation, beginning to understand what was happening in the brain. And really since then, most of my work in one way or another has been trying to take some of that wisdom that's there in Eastern philosophy and also in Western philosophy and apply it in ordinary, everyday life. Because I think if philosophy is valuable, it needs to be applicable to people whose main concern is paying the bills and keeping their kids in school and keeping their job. And I think it can. So I think I've really married the two, and in a lot of my writing, I think my scientific training has allowed me to write in a way that I can use a sort of, almost called a popular science style of writing to talk about these issues, which I think is very important. I think today we live in an age of reason, and if you want to convince people, I think you have to make ideas reasonable.
Right. Well, one of the ideas that runs throughout the book is this idea of the increasing pace of life.
Yes.
It seems that everywhere you go and everyone you talk to is starting to act in a way more and more frantically, and people don't know how to cope with this increasing pace of life. First of all, I'd like to ask you, why does it seem that life is speeding up as it is?
Why does it seem it is speeding up? Well, life isn't speeding up. What is speeding up is the rate of change in our society. Technically, I talk about this in the book, it's what's called novelty, which is the rate at which new things appear in society. So 200 years ago, the rate of invention, the rate of change was much slower than it was now. 2,000 years ago, it was slower still. You go back even further,
Right.
20,000 years ago, it was much slower. And one of the reasons for this is each new advance, each new development speeds up future development. And we can see this happening today so clearly with the whole computer information revolution, that we develop technologies which make life go faster and faster. And so today, I mean, it's something like 90% of all inventions have happened in the last 50 years. And probably a large number of those have happened in the last 10 or 20 years.
But isn't it also true that the actual resonant frequency of the Earth is increasing? The Schumann frequency, we've been told, has been speeding up.
I don't know. I haven't heard it. That's interesting if it is. That's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, I've heard it used to be something like 7.75, and now it could be somewhere around 13 cycles per second. So
that may be I'm hesitant about that because the Schumann frequency is determined by the actual physical diameter of the Earth, the speed of light. It's a number of times light can go round the Earth, and light can go round the Earth 7.5 times in a second.
Okay.
And for that to change, I think the radius of the Earth has got to change. But anyway...
We'll have to look into that.
Yes, I think that's done by a geologist, Greg Braden. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No, I'm not.
All right.
There's something here, obviously, I don't know about, yeah.
Well, with the pace of life accelerating the way it is, there must be a limit to how fast things can change.
In some areas, yes. I think there's a limit to how fast technology can change. I don't think we're there yet. But there's going to be a limit to how fast people can develop new products, new bits of software, get them onto the market. Though obviously with the internet, that's going to get much, much, much faster. But I think we are going to move on into a new area of change. One thing I show in the book is that acceleration happens within each phase. Like there was acceleration within the industrial age, there was acceleration within the information age, and also back earlier in the agricultural age. And then each one of those, in a sense, levels off and gives way to the next area. And I think what we're seeing now in information technology will get much, much faster, and then it'll stabilize and give way to a new area of development. And what I'm suggesting is that the next area to come after the information age is something we probably don't have a word for at the moment. I call it the consciousness age, when what's going to be happening then is that the major focus of human exploration is going to be the human mind. I think that's the direction we're moving in, and that could go much faster still, because when we talk about breakthroughs in thinking, breakthroughs in consciousness, I think many of us have had experiences when the time is ripe, we can go through amazing changes almost, in minutes.
That brings up to mind, there was a statement made that man's technology has outdistanced his humanity. And consciously we have to be able to hold this speed of discovery and unfoldment. And so consciousness is really another frontier that we must address.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I have to say inner space is the next frontier.
Yes.
I think everything is pushing us towards it. We're not there yet. I think we're seeing the beginning signs that what's been happening the last 10, 20, 30 years is people in all walks of life beginning to get interested in, whether it's meditation or personal growth, workshops, whatever. The move has started. I think in the future, that's going to become much, much more mainstream. At the moment, we're a bit like computers were 50 years ago. They were obviously something, it was significant, but they were on the sideline. And now we've seen they become totally mainstream.
Yes, and isn't it also very necessary? Because how do we handle this? It's as though people are burning out. They can't handle the speed of all of this change. So we do need to have the technology, of the inner technology, in order to handle the outer changes that are coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what a lot of the book is about, is how do we develop the inner stability, the inner flexibility that's going to see us through. Because you're absolutely right. I think the main handicap at the moment is the fact we haven't really evolved significantly inwardly for thousands of years. We've evolved all this wonderful external technology where we're masters of the material world in a way that nobody could have imagined even 50 years ago. But as far as our minds are concerned, we still know very little about, our thinking, our feeling,
yes,
what the self is, and that's what's holding us back. And that's why I think that is going to be the next frontier, is to explore the human mind. Because if we can release the human mind and help people, then I think we're not only going to help people cope with the enormous amount of change, but we can also begin to wake up to our true potential.
And what do you see is going to lead us? How are we going to make this jump from our outer rush to that inner? What do you see as being the thing that's going to wake us to that need?
I think there's going to be several things waking us. I think one of the things that's happening right now in our culture is a lot of people just realizing that the old materialistic way doesn't work. It works to a certain extent. I mean, in terms of getting us good food, water, shelter, clothing, in terms of getting the basics of life, it's doing fine. But in terms of actually satisfying our being, it doesn't work at all. There's a lot of evidence out at the moment. There's been several books published on the idea recently that nothing we've done in the last 20, 30, 40 years in our society has actually made anybody any happier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are beginning to realize this, that just having even more money, and another boat or whatever it is for the weekends doesn't actually make you any happier. And I think that's one of the reasons many people are beginning to use some of their own time and money and energy to begin to look at themselves and move in this direction.
In your book you talk about this idea of materialism in great length.
Yeah. And
you talk about the fact that we're in a cultural trance, and that this is sort of like a virus. You call it a meme, is that right?
Yes. It is, and I liken it to a virus as well. It's like a mental virus in the mind. And
what do we do about that?
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize what it is. And the meme I'm talking about is the idea which is really inculcated into us from birth onwards. And that this meme, this belief system says, if you're not happy, then you need to do something in the world. The world isn't right. You need to change your circumstances in one way or another way. Maybe just going out and buying yourself a new jacket, or going to the movies, or changing your relationship or your job or whatever. But we always look outside ourselves, and I think that's the virus we've got stuck with, which isn't appropriate in our culture anymore. So the first thing is to realize that each of us, we get stuck in that when we're not feeling good, we look outside ourselves to fill something missing inside.
Right. When you're not happy, you go shopping, or
exactly.
When you're not happy, you stuff yourself with food.
Yes.
Inappropriate food at that.
So I think the first thing is to recognize that what we all want, every single one of us, ultimately what we're looking for is to feel okay. We're looking to avoid pain, avoid suffering. We're looking to be more at peace, happier, to feel better in ourselves. So we're looking for an inner state. That's the key thing. We're looking for an inner state. And then to start using that when we make decisions. I mean, a couple of questions I often ask myself when I find myself particularly attached to having something in the world or somebody be a certain way to me. Whenever I've got one of those fixations going, I say to myself, first of all, if I got this, would I really be happy? And the answer is no, probably not. You still find something else to be unhappy about, or they wouldn't satisfy you as much as you thought. And the second question is, even if I don't get it the way I want it, can I still be happy? And the answer, of course, is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the second part, is realizing that whether or not we're happy is nothing to do with what we have out there. It's to do with how we see things. It's our interpretation of events. And that is something we have a lot more choice over than we realize. We can choose how we see things.
Yeah, so we go to perception.
Yes. I mean, to give you a very simple example I often use when I'm working with corporations is being stuck in a traffic jam. Most people say traffic jams make them upset, make them stressed. And what I point out is the traffic jam isn't doing anything to you. What is happening is there's a voice in your head, which is usually the voice of fear, of all the bad things that are going to happen to you if you're late, what's going to happen to your job or your home, whatever it is. It's the voice of fear telling you this isn't a good situation. That's what's causing the stress. Somebody else could be sitting in exactly the same situation, and inside their head, they could be saying, hey, this is wonderful. It's the sort of situation I've been waiting for all day. I've got no meetings to sit through, nobody's problems to solve. I can sit back, I can relax, I can put on some music. So you've got exactly the same situation, two totally different perceptions of it, leading to two totally different reactions, the two different emotional responses.
Yes.
So that's I think that is one of the key things I try to teach people in my workshops, is what I call spirituality 101. It's the realization that how we see things is as important as what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so true, I think, in our relationships as well. How we see the other person is such a critical factor.
Oh, yes.
You say that we are sort of victims of this kind of thinking that is more appropriate to pre-industrial times. And, as a child, that I had that feeling too, that even though we were living in, so-called modern times, you call it industrial times, I felt that we were actually very almost prehistoric, even though we had shiny chrome bumpers and we had shiny airplanes and fast cars and modern medicine, that we were still living in a time that was almost prehistoric to me. That's how it felt.
Yes. And I think it's because we still got these programs about how to survive, and how to survive in prehistoric times was making sure you had enough food hoarded, or whatever it was, that you were in control of the situation. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've actually solved most of those problems. I mean, I think if we just go back 200 years before the Industrial Revolution, we forget how different life was. Most of us were working on the land 7 days a week, 6 days a week, through the winter. Winters were very, very hard. A lot of people died of malnutrition. We've dealt with all those problems now. As I say, we just go down to the supermarket to get our food in the winter. We can get food from the tropics in the winter. And yet our thinking underneath hasn't changed. We've still got this very acquisitive, got to control the external world sort of consciousness.
Yeah, we're still, in a way, because of the looming Y2K thing, we're still, in a way, very vulnerable to a glitch in the computer system, because very insidiously over the last 10 or 20 years, we've become more and more dependent on computers.
Yeah.
If you look at a company like General Motors, and I was in General Motors making a film once, and they have this thing called just-in-time delivery, where all their little hundreds of suppliers around the country deliver parts just in time. And if for instance, they don't have the door for a certain model of a car, if they run out of doors, they have to hire an airplane and fly them in, especially so they don't shut down the whole line. Now, can you imagine with their 600 or so suppliers, what would happen if just a few of them were off because their computers are down?
Well, I think
aren't you a little worried about that?
Yes, I think this is the big fear around the whole Y2K issue, or one of the big fears. It's not that, individual systems that it's not that the IRS is going to completely break down, etc. I think it's much more. You're going to have all these little things just going wrong here and there, which are going to have major knock-on effects. You could have, something down the line affecting the person who makes the car door, which affects Ford, which then affects something else, and I think it could be chaos because of all these little glitches. I mean, we already know you take a computer program and we get one bad line of code in a computer program, we get a bug, and, the whole system crashes sometimes. It's like you then you sprinkle in thousands of bugs throughout our culture, and then, without knowing what's going to happen. And I think you're absolutely right. It's going to have knock-on effects. Little tiny changes have knock-on effects throughout the system. Right. So I'm very worried about what's going to happen then.
But in one sense, isn't this going to then be the kind of one of the focal points that will cause individuals to have to go inside?
Yes, and I think it is already.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by people who now, when they discover the whole Y2K issue, go through some really deep personal work. I mean, the first reaction usually is denial. Oh, Bill Gates will sort it out. My computer's okay. I've got a Macintosh. I don't have to worry. Whatever it is.
We've had some of that here.
Yes, I have that here.
You don't have to worry. And then The second phase is people getting it and seeing what it means on a social level. And when people start getting it, they then move into the opposite, which is fear and panic. And this is going to be awful.
Yeah, how much food should we store up, and, and water, and batteries?
What do I do with, and particularly people who are heavily invested in the stock market, what do I do with my money?
Yes.
And I've seen people go through a lot of, I think, quite profound spiritual awakening because of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like what happens to people sometimes when they learn they've got a life-threatening illness. That can actually be a blessing for them because it causes them to stop and really look at their lives. And sometimes they make profound changes, which actually can be very healing for them. And I think it's the same with Y2K. It has that potential to cause us to stop and say, what, these are all these attachments. How am I living my life if these are the things I'm really worried about?
And what an incredible millennial shift. Perfect timing.
I know. I'm absolutely fascinated by the whole picture of the millennium, how we've seen all the stories about the millennium, about this awful time, and then it's going to be light on the other side, and wars and troubles, etc., and then the return of the light. And it's almost like the whole thing has been collapsed now out of our own hands. We produced a crisis right on the dot of the millennium. It's not like it's around the millennium.
Yes, isn't that amazing?
It's not like it's 2 years before, a couple of years afterwards. It's on midnight of the new millennium. We produce a crisis.
It almost seems that's what Nostradamus was talking about.
Yes.
The end of time.
Yes. And then out of that, I think out of that's going to come a lot of chaos, but I think also a lot of awakening.
Yes.
And I think more and more people are seeing this now. There's a spiritual aspect to it.
So what are you going to be doing?
What am I going to be doing? I'm going to be at home.
Midnight on
I'm going to be at home. I thought for many years, where do I want to be? And I thought, I really want to be at home. And my home is in England, although I spend a lot of time out here. My home is in England. And that's where I want to be. I should probably, since I live out in the middle of the woods in a cottage where I've lived off the grid for 26 years now. I've lived without electricity. So I could be there and probably not notice.
Oh, lovely.
So you have your kerosene lanterns and
yes,
a few cans of food?
I've had those for 20-odd years. I've lived that way for 20-odd years, 25 years, so that's no problem. I suspect I can have a lot of friends who want to come and stay with me.
Probably. Well, we did an interview a couple of weeks ago with a woman who is off the grid in Hawaii. And, we were still able to do an interview. They have solar power, they're on the internet. So, if the plug is pulled on the year 2000, there won't be a problem for them. They've already started a community garden and so forth.
Well, it depends how big what really happens. If it's a major social disruption, they're going to be affected by it in the end.
Well, look, Peter, we've got to take a little break here.
Okay.
We're with Peter Russell, who is the author of Waking Up in Time, and we're talking about how to find inner peace in these times of accelerating change. So stay with us. You're in the Millennium Cafe. I'm Steve Fryer with my co-host Kathleen Jacoby, and we'll be right back right after this. And we are back. This is Steve Fryer with my co-host Kathleen Jacoby, and you're in the Millennium Cafe with Peter Russell, author of Waking Up in Time. Peter, a few years ago, I became aware of you because of a videotape. Quite interesting. It was called The Global Brain, I believe.
Yes. That was a video actually made about 1983 when the Global Brain book first came out. And I was doing a lot of audio-visual shows, and people were saying it's no good having an audio tape of your lectures because they're so visual. And so I just made a videotape of some lectures and didn't realise how much it was going to take off. But it's amazing how much that spread, and I hear again and again people using it in classrooms and conferences and things like that.
So is that videotape still available?
Yes, it is. If you can't get it, a lot of alternative bookstores have it. If you can't get it, the best place, I'll give you a phone number, is 650-327-2012. 650-327-2012. And they stock both videos. That's the publisher of the Global Brain book.
I imagine being so scientific and everything, you probably have a website too.
Yes, that's quite simple. It's Pete. Oh, no, that's my email address. Sorry. The website is just Pete Russell, PeteRussell. So just my name, peterussell.com. It's not Peter Russell, but Pete Russell.
Oh, that's very clever.
That's cute.
Pete Russell with 2Ls.com.
All right.
And I also have another video which is relevant to this book called The White Hole in Time.
What's that about?
It's very much about the theme in this book. It's about the acceleration and the sorts of changes in consciousness that's pushing us towards and forcing us to make.
And so people can get that there also?
Yes, they can get that. Yes.
Oh, very good. And through any other bookstores or?
The video, you probably get, yes, you get that video as well through sort of alternative bookstores who do videos.
All right.
It was on Amazon, but I heard recently it's just been taken off. I'm going to get it back on again soon.
Oh, well, we'll have people call in or write, I email in and say we want it back on.
Yeah. It's one of the things I've got to do in the next day or two anyway.
Well, you're really about talking about a change in consciousness and how people can make that. And I've read in various places that to make a change in consciousness, it's easier if you have work taken care of, or if you've got some leisure time, and that may be true. But what about those people that live in the other parts of the world who don't have it so smooth as we do in the West?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that it is just for the affluent people. I think what is true is that those of us in the West who've got plenty of spare time have got time to go to workshops and sit back and read books and things. So we have those sorts of opportunities. But I also think a lot of people who are just surviving, just getting through in life with no spare time, not really affluent, they can still be going through a lot of spiritual growth, spiritual awakening. I mean, sometimes it's those hard times that really push you to wake up and look at things in a new perspective. And I think that's the key of the spiritual work is letting go of our attachments, discovering that inner freedom. So I think it can happen at all levels.
Now you say in your book that personal relationships are a form of spiritual practice. What do you mean by that?
Yes. I think they're the most important ones, particularly for us in the West. I mean, Ram Dass once said relationships are the yoga of the West, meaning that's our path to awakening. Mm-hmm. And I think, well, first of all, it's in our relationships that we really begin to see some of the stuff we have to work on. I think, we can get by fine for an hour or two on the air, and we could probably spend a nice weekend together, put us living together closely for a few years, and we'd soon start coming up with all this different stuff that goes on in ourselves, our buttons, whatever you want to call it.
I think that's sort of the joke. People that have decided to drop out of society and, they start an intentional community or they join one.
Yeah.
And as soon as they get there and they're cut off from the outside world, they realize that they brought their problems with them, and they have to work even harder then to make peace with their fellow co-inhabitants of the intentional community.
Yes. I mean, we take our problems with us, and then what other people do is they get into a relationship and they find it's not working for some reason or other. They go off and get into another relationship and they take the same set of problems with them, and they go through life that way. I think ultimately we have to be prepared to really sit down and look at ourselves and look at where are we holding ourselves back? What are some of the belief systems we got stuck in which are not appropriate? And that's where relationships can also be, I think, a great service. They can be like, we can have couple teams, if you like, really helping each other on their personal awakening.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, you can be, it's as though a relationship is a marvelous tool for projection. You just look at the other and they're a mirror in some way of something about yourself. And so as we point the finger out there, it's like turning it right back to ourselves as we're making our pronouncements about the whatever.
We have certainly found that to be true.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, and I look at this in the book, is that we can use that in a positive way as well. We can turn that cycle around. Because I think one thing that happens so much in relationships, I see this in my own and many other people's, is it's very easy to get in a vicious circle of attacking each other. Mm-hmm. And it needn't be overt attacking, it can be very subtle, just like body language or tone of voice or whatever. And each time somebody is subtly attacking the other person feels slightly hurt, and they attack back, and you get into this thing where basically you've got two people both wanting to be loved. That's such a deep need. We all have that. We all want to be loved.
Yes, of course.
And yet we're trying to get loved by actually withholding it from the other person, or threatening the other person, or being mean to the other person because they're not loving us enough. And the other person feels this. They say, this person isn't loving me enough, I'll be mean back to them.
Yes.
And I think the solution is a very simple one in principle, and it's very profound when you start practicing it. And that is just for two people to say, my intention is that I will never do anything consciously to hurt the other person. Let my intention be, whatever I do or say, that the other person feels good and feels loved on hearing it.
Those would make fantastic wedding vows, actually, to bring it to that level.
Well, that's what, I mean, when the Buddha first started teaching, that was one of his definitions of right speech. He said, if you can't say anything so that the other person feels good, it is better to retain noble silence. And then he added, until you worked out how to say it. It's not a cop-out. It's not saying anything, but it's like, yes, communicate the truth, but how we communicate the truth is equally important, and we should communicate the truth always in a way that the other person finds loving, that they find makes them feel appreciated. And if we do that, I know when I've done this in my relationships, where both people concerned have that agreement, it's amazing the changes that begin to happen, just through that intention that the other person is going to feel loved, rather than you're just going to try and, win over them in some way.
So we practice kindness.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, that's what it comes down to, is the practice of kindness in the end.
Do you think it's ever justified to tell a white lie in order to be kind?
I would say in principle not.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, I think talking about what's true in principle and what it comes down to in practice, given our own weaknesses, etc., is always a shady area. But I think in principle, you always tell the truth, and the challenge is finding out how to tell the truth. Telling a white lie is because I can't work out how to say it. But I think in principle, we can always find out how to communicate something so that the other person does feel loved.
Do you feel these principles can be applied to politics?
Yes. On many levels. I mean,
how would you advise Bill Clinton right now?
I knew he was getting around to that.
Well, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
I won't.
The hornet's nest.
I don't even know what's happening to him right now. But I mean, take it right up to the level of international politics. What went on in the Cold War? It was exactly that, a vicious circle of people trying to make, each side trying to make the other side feel scared, make them feel fear. We are more powerful than you. And I wrote a piece at the time, which I was bringing up the point, what would happen if we took the opposite point of view? What would happen if the West had said, what is it that Russia really needs right now? We're seeing where they're vulnerable and poking their fears. But if we look, what is it they really want? And address that need. What were their weaknesses? What were their vulnerabilities? If we gone and said, okay, how can we help you? It would have been a completely different approach.
Well, it's again, Peter, this whole idea of we seem to have to make other people wrong. It's always this dual nature, this or that, rather than the and.
Yes, yeah. And I think part of this comes back to that mindset I was talking about earlier, that meme that runs through our society that says, how we feel inside depends upon what's going on outside us, and that not only applies to the cars we drive, it's the people we know and how we relate to them. And so we start making people objects.
Yes.
And we start wanting people to be the way we think they should be for us to be happy.
Yes.
I think that's what separates us and alienates us from other people the whole time.
We're busy projecting our images out there, and they become props.
Yes.
Rather than looking at them for what they are and projecting again our kindness.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the ultimate projection, the good projection, is in the end to recognise that we are all the same.
Yes.
And we are all beings who are looking for peace. We're looking for love, and we all have our stuff to work through, and we don't always do it in the right way, and we need to be compassionate with each other for our mistakes we make, but ultimately we're all looking for the same thing, and we're not competing for it. That's the great thing. If you're talking about love or peace of mind, we're not competing for those things, we're in cooperation for it, because the more I can give you peace and love, I'm talking about inner peace, the better you feel, the more you can give it back to me.
And if we can realize that they're not finite, those are not finite elements, they're infinite.
Exactly.
Plenty to go around.
Yes.
Yeah, the more we give, the more we get back.
Peter, do you mind talking about your spiritual practice?
Not at all. It's a mixture of things, really. As we talked about, I got into meditation back in the late 60s, early 70s, and that was transcendental meditation, and that's remained my core practice ever since, in terms of just a technique of really quietening the mind down.
So it's basically TM. We're coming up on a break here, unfortunately, Peter. Darn those breaks, but we love our sponsors. Anyway, we're with Peter Russell, author of Waking Up in Time. I'm Steve Fryer, along with Kathleen Jacoby. You're in the Millenium Cafe, and we'll be right back, right after this. And we're back. This is Steve Fryer, along with my co-host Kathleen Jacoby, and you're in the Millenium Cafe with Peter Russell, scientist, author of Waking Up in Time. We've only got a couple of minutes left here, Peter, so I want to give out your contact information for people that are interested in buying your video or the book itself.
Right. Well, the book should be in most stores.
Well, have you got anything you'd like to say in the remaining minute here? No, it's not a lot of time, but
tying up civilization in this last moment.
Time is compressed.
I think breathe is the final thing. We're talking about practice. I mean, I'm saying meditation, but I think another thing I find really important on a very mundane day-to-day level is just remembering to breathe, particularly between tasks. When I rush from one thing to another in the day, to stop for a minute, calm down, breathe, relax, center myself, touch back in to myself is so important. And the more things speed up and we get busier and busier, I think we're going to need means of just slowing down and keeping in touch with ourselves on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour level.
Wonderful recommendation.
Well, Peter, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us here in the Millenium Cafe. And I want to urge everybody to go out and buy his book, Waking Up in Time. And you'll find how he found inner peace in these accelerating times of change. I want to remind our listeners also to find our show next week. We'll be on at 1 p.m. at a regular time. So, Peter, once again, thank you for being here with us.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been most enjoyable.
Yeah.
And have a wonderful trip back to your home in England.
Thank you.
The Millenium Cafe was brought to you by your healthier choice, Bay Area distributors of Young Living Essential Oils, the highest quality essential oils commercially available. If you care about your health, get involved with a company that's making a difference, a company with heart, soul, and integrity. For a free guide to using essential oils, call your healthier choice at 1-800-645-7991. That's 1-800-645-7991. Thanks for joining us in the Millenium Cafe. Join us again next week, same time, same station, when we'll once again explore trailblazing ideas and possibilities through visionary guests who are helping us expand our consciousness as we enter the third millennium. Ask your friends to join us each week at this time.